Hello and welcome. I'm Gabrielle Lyon, Executive Director of Illinois Humanities, and I'm speaking to you from Springfield in front of the old state Capitol building. I want to welcome you to the latest installment of our series, The Country and the City, Common Ground in the Prairie State. Funding for this program was generously provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and the Mellon Foundation. If you're not familiar with us, Illinois Humanities is a nonprofit statewide organization, and we activate the humanities across the state through free public programs like the one you're seeing tonight, grants and education opportunities with the focus of fostering reflection, sparking conversation, building community, and most of all, strengthening civic engagement. So what is the humanities? Why is it important? I think the most important thing about the humanities is that it's really intended and designed to give us the time and space to reflect on our lives, on our experiences, and best of all, gives us a window onto the experiences of others. This series in particular, Country in the City, Common Ground in this Prairie State, gives us a chance to meet some of our urban, rural, suburban neighbors and get to know each other a little bit better, hopefully maybe even understand each other a little bit better. I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. Normally, we would have done this program live and been all together, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've pre-recorded the content. However, the video is accompanied by a live chat, and we would love to hear your questions, your feedback, and we'll do our best to respond as the show unfolds. Tonight's program is called Distributions, People, Places, and Power, Gallatin County Edition. Now, what does that title mean? Here to introduce us to the program this evening is our wonderful statewide engagement manager, Matt Meacham, joining us from Edwardsville, Illinois.
Thanks, Gabe. Many of the most vigorously contested issues confronting our nation, our state, and our communities involve the relationship between population distribution and the allocation of political power and public resources. That complicated relationship has affected our national life at least since 1787, when the authors of the Constitution established one chamber of Congress in which representation is determined by population, the House of Representatives, and another in which each state has two members regardless of population, the Senate. Issues arising from the relationship of people, places, and power are as relevant now as they were then, and they show no sign of diminishing as more people gravitate to metropolitan areas, while many rural places experience population loss. This evening's program is the first in a series entitled Distributions, People, Places, and Power, in which we'll explore the relationship between people and power in places around Illinois where that relationship seems especially significant. We start in Gallatin County, one of the 15 original counties of Illinois, located in the southeastern part of the state. Two Gallatin County communities, Shawneetown and Equality, were among the most important towns in Illinois during the first 2 decades of its statehood in the early 1800s. They eventually were eclipsed by cities such as Springfield and Chicago. Today, Gallatin is the second most sparsely populated county in Illinois. It can seem distant, literally and figuratively, from the places with the largest concentrations of political influence and public resources in our state. Gallatin County's evolution illustrates the dramatic changes in population distribution that have occurred over our state's history, as well as the resulting changes in the distribution of political power. Our first segment was written by regional historian Todd Carr and also features Christy Short and Joe Patrick of the Gallatin County Historical Society. They'll tell us more about the significance of Gallatin County in Illinois' early years as a state.
Southeastern Illinois has been inhabited for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence such as pottery shards, ancient stone walls, and various mounds along the rivers shows habitation by Native Americans in the early woodland and Mississippian periods. Early European visitors to the area found long-used animal traces leading from the river to the Great Salt Springs and Half Moon Lick of Gallatin County.
In our courthouse in Gallatin County, there is a mural that was part of a WPA project, and it has captivated me for most of my life every time I get to see it, whether I'm there doing business or whatnot. But I always try to take a look at this thing. I'd recommend taking a look at this mural if you get a chance. It has a depiction of Gallatin County's a lot of Gallatin County's history involving the salt trade, indigenous people, the river, traffic, steamboats, etc. This was a bustling area in the county. It was the heart and the hub. And I typically get a buzz and go back to my second grade field trip to see that. That was the first time that I saw it as a child. And it has still captivated me after all these years. I don't know if you can recreate that on a piece of paper. I think it's something that people need to see. It does capture a lot of this area.
For countless generations, Native Americans gathered salt from the springs using evaporation with clay basins. When French explorers arrived in Illinois in the 1600s, they obtained salt from the springs as well. A French fort or blockhouse once stood on a bluff overlooking the salt springs where the village of Equality is now. The village gets its name from the French Revolution slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The British gained control of the region at the close of the French and Indian War. When George Rogers Clark marched across Illinois during the American Revolution, the Illinois Territory was seized from the British and eventually became part of the Northwest Territory. In 1803, William Henry Harrison, then governor of the territory, obtained the Great Salt Springs and the surrounding area from the remaining tribes in return for an annual stipend of salt produced at the springs. The salt works became the first major industry in the Illinois Territory. That same year, the United States completed the Louisiana Purchase, opening trading opportunities downriver, and the settlement of the Illinois Territory began in earnest. The Gallatin County region became an important factor in the settling of Illinois and the march toward statehood. Around 1800, a settlement was started near an abandoned Shawnee Indian village downriver of the confluence of the Wabash and Ohio rivers. Shawneetown was chartered by the United States government as an administrative center in the region. It holds the distinction of being the only city besides Washington, D.C., specifically chartered by Congress. In 1810, the town was surveyed and platted. A post office that once served a 5-state region opened in 1811. In 1814, a federal land office was established in the village and eventually sold more than 3.5 million acres of land. John Marshall received a charter to start a bank in 1816 with a group of private investors. The Bank of Illinois was first in a log cabin, and in 1822 moved to a brick structure now known as the John Marshall House.
John Marshall came to this area from Ireland, and his father had purchased some land here in America, and John Marshall and a couple of his brothers came here to take over that land and farm it or make some money off of it somehow. They got married, had families, became merchants, postmasters, bankers, and so John Marshall was an immigrant and found needs in the area and stepped up and fulfilled them.
Congress appropriated funds in 1816 to develop the Kaskaskia-Shawneetown Trail. This trail linked two of the most important towns in Illinois, Shawneetown on the Ohio River and the Mississippi River town of Kaskaskia, which served as the territorial capital and the first state capital. During the American Revolution, General Thomas Posey served as an aide-de-camp to General George Washington. Posey later served several positions in territorial, state, and federal governments. He died while visiting his daughter's home in Shawneetown in 1818. His gravesite is now Westwood Cemetery, where several other notables from early statehood are buried. One in particular is John McLean. McLean was the state's first representative to the U.S. Congress, an Illinois Speaker of the House, and a U.S. Senator. In 1824, President James Monroe invited the revolutionist Marquis de Lafayette to visit each state of the Union. His visit to Illinois occurred May 8, 1825, when a reception was held in his honor at Shawneetown. The Great Salt Springs became the property of the state of Illinois in 1818. The original provisions of the Northwest Ordinance proclaimed Illinois Territory to be free of slavery, even though the French had brought enslaved people to the area a century earlier. The first Illinois Constitution legalized slavery in this specific location for the purpose of operating the salt works. In 1819, nearly 300,000 bushels of salt were produced through a labor-intensive process in which more than 1,000 enslaved people boiled brine from the salt wells. It is said that around one-third of the new state's revenue came from leases on these salt works. In the 1820s, Illinois began selling portions of the salt well holdings to finance Illinois' first prison at Alton. Most of the land reserved for the Illinois Salines would eventually be under the control of John Hart Crenshaw. Crenshaw began his salt operations by leasing the wells from the government and workers from surrounding slave states. Even after the slavery clause of the Constitution sunset in the 1820s, Crenshaw continued to lease enslaved labor through a loophole in the provisions for indentured servitude. He was also implicated in the trading of free blacks into slavery in the South. Crenshaw amassed such property and wealth that in 1838 he built a 3-story manor house overlooking his holdings, called Hickory Hill. It was operated as a tourist attraction from the 1930s to 1990s as the Old Slave House. Crenshaw's power was such that he was twice prosecuted for kidnapping, but never convicted.
I mean, if you don't remember history, you're doomed to repeat it. That's an obvious answer. But, you know, not everything's sunshine and lollipops. I mean, we've all grown up. And even folks that are the most privileged have still had their ups and downs. And, you know, I think it could be somewhat crippling to try to take all the bad out of history. Was when you are faced with something bad, you don't know how to handle it, and then you don't have a reference to go back and see how someone else handled it. I feel that it has. I feel more of experience with folks, being around people, and learning about different cultures, taking the time, understanding, or maybe even going against what your parents taught you in some regards. Things have definitely changed for the better in the past 30 years, sure.
By the 1870s, salt making became less lucrative as other sources for salt were found closer to the population centers of the East. Shawneetown's importance to the growing state of Illinois declined as power shifted further north. Ohio River floods forced the town to build a levee system that succeeding floods forced higher and higher. Finally, after the flood of 1937, residents moved the town further inland. Today, the original Old Shawneetown consists mostly of a few scattered residences and empty lots.
I find that a lot of people that live here underappreciate the history of the area, and a lot of them just don't know it. When they come down to the museum for tours, one of the most common phrases is, "I've never been here before. I've lived here my whole life. I've never been here." Well, I didn't know that. And I always find that very surprising because I've only been here for 11 years, and in that time frame, I have learned an amazing amount of history. This place is amazing.
A folk narrative still circulating in southeastern Illinois reminds residents that Gallatin County was once a major center of power within the young state. Chicago was organized in 1833 with a population of around 200. Public land sales in the Chicago area began in 1835, and the town grew rapidly. The city was incorporated in 1837, and the following year, B.S. Morris was elected as its second mayor. Perhaps, due to its rapid growth, Chicago found itself in need of capital. The folklore says some Chicago investors traveled downstate to the Bank of Illinois in Shawneetown. The investors made a formal request for both a loan and a bank branch for the growing city. Cashier John Siddall replied on behalf of the Bank of Illinois in a letter dated July 5, 1838. He regretted to inform Mayor Morris that there was too much demand for money in southern Illinois for the bank to make the loan requests. In fact, the bank had discontinued making any further loans. As to locating a branch in Chicago, Mr. Siddall said the board of directors was bound by the legislature to establish 3 branches that had already been chosen and were unable at the time to consider any others. According to tradition, the loan was denied because Chicago was either too far away from a navigable river or too far from Shawneetown, specifically, to ever amount to anything. In October 1960, the First National Bank of Shawneetown sought to rectify the slight on Chicago by presenting a resolution to the then oldest bank in Chicago, the Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company. The tongue-in-cheek resolution stated that Chicago's credit is good, and further declared citizens of that city will be welcome in Shawneetown as borrowers, visitors, or permanent residents. The Continental sent a reply to Shawneetown that the Bank of Illinois was following good banking principles by keeping their loans within sight of the smoke from the chimney, and didn't blame them for turning down a loan to a small group of squatters in a wild onion patch too far away to watch.
Thanks to Christy, Joe, and Todd. Whether or not that story about the denial of a loan to investors from Chicago contains any historical truth, it is a folk narrative that reminds generations of Gallatin Countyans that Shawneetown was once powerful enough, at least in theory, to influence the fate of Chicago. Ironically, it also reminds them that the bankers were mistaken. Chicago did prosper and now has about 2,000 times as many residents as Shawneetown. The story raises some important, pressing questions. Given the huge differences of population between the Chicago metropolitan area and rural communities such as Shawneetown and Gallatin County, what's the fairest approach to sharing political power and public resources? Is there potential for cooperation that could benefit both? How do rural-urban dynamics influence Illinoisans' political views and voting patterns? For some well-informed perspectives on those questions, we turn to Rhonda Belford, a civic and political leader from Hardin County, State Senator Dale Fowler of the 59th District, Amaya Pawar, a former Chicago alderman who ran for governor in 2017, Glenn Pichard, who represented much of Southern Illinois in Congress in the 1990s, and Sheila Simon, who served as lieutenant governor from 2011 to 2015. Moderating the discussion is John Shaw, director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale.
When and why and how did Southern Illinois go from being so solidly Democratic to so solidly Republican? What was the trigger point? What events stimulated that change, and why is it a consequential change?
When the Roosevelt administration came along with WPA, with the Civilian Conservation Corps, with Social Security, with the Farm Home Administration, these kinds of things, it spoke to that poverty. And it particularly spoke to the poverty in southeastern Illinois where we grew up. And those programs really pulled up people like my mom and dad. My dad only had one arm. He went to work as a water boy on a construction crew building roads throughout the old Shawnee National Forest that the government had bought up, which was at that time scrub brush. My mom, they ran a van out into the hills and picked up women, and she was bused 13 miles into Carmike where they had built a new nursing home, and she had a job scrubbing floors and cleaning rooms. That Roosevelt administration program that built that nursing home, that started, you know, that turned people to Democrats. And the 50s were a pretty good time, but those areas remained Democrat. In the early 60s, there were some things that shook the foundations of some of the conservative, moderate Democrats in the way of the women's movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, those kinds of things. But then the Great Society came along with Johnson, and that reestablished in their minds the Roosevelt. And that went along fine because the mines, which Gallatin County and others depended upon, were unionized. But then when President Reagan came along and you saw the diminishment of the unions, The Clean Air Act came along in the early 90s and got rid of the unions in the coal mines and so on, or started to diminish that because we couldn't sell the coal. The Democrat Party began to diminish along with that, plus the fact that the evangelical movement became stronger and stronger as the moral majority and so on took more control of the Southern Baptist Convention. And the churches here are greatly Baptist and evangelical, and for the most part in Southern Illinois. And so with that evangelical movement becoming so strong, with the diminishment of the unions, you know, I grew up in a small Southern Baptist church, which was all Democrat when I was growing up. Today, those churches are all Republican because of the evangelical movement. And so with the diminishment of the unions, with the rise of evangelical churches and so on, that all trended toward the Republican Party.
As a young kid working at the Cave and Rock State Park and many of these other places, IDNR, the parks were flowing with kids that were working on CETA programs and some of the state programs in the summertime. These kids were learning good work ethics. A lot of the kids today, they're very fortunate if they can do some kind of private sector job working at McDonald's or something like that, but they're few and far between. They were learning how to have good work ethic, those types of things that were set in place that we don't have as much of today. But those are the kids that are now my age and older. And those are kids that, whether they're Democrats or Republican, have conservative and good work ethic. And those are the kids today that are now considering their candidates and their stances. So those are the ones that are leaning toward those good faith values. And even I was speaking to someone who was raised as a Democrat in Gallatin County, and they're the ones that are the ones that's helping cause this red wave all across the southern region. And they'll be the first to tell you, while they know that President Trump isn't perfect, he's still perfect for this job. And that's how they feel, because they're, you know, leading, just like Amaya mentioned, the job status, those types of things, it's important to them. And like we say, they may, because of their grandparents and things like that, in Gallatin County in particular, they may vote in the primary just because of the precedents that's set. They may vote Democrat, or they may have to because they'd already set that precedent. But when it comes to the general election, they're going to vote Republican because of those faith values and those types of things, because they're considering those candidates and their stance.
I think there's a split between how we look at state level and national level politics and how we look at local politics. And I think in each place, in each way, there's a hunger for folks who understand us, right? Who get what it's like. And in Southern Illinois, we often feel picked on or left out. And I think that's one of the reasons why Trump really capitalized in his first election on that feeling that no one is speaking for me. And I think he passed off this image as, I'm willing to speak for those who are not in great financial situations. I don't think that's who he represents, but I think that's what he passed off. Having said that, I think we are still excited about anyone who's ready to step in and represent us, whether they're Democratic or Republican. We have a history of some pretty cool and colorful members of Congress from the area: Kent Keller, Ken Gray, and of course, Glenn is pretty fabulous, and I'm biased towards my own favorite former congressman from Southern Illinois. But I think that the idea is that when someone puts themselves forward, represents us, and actively engages in working on what we need, whether they're Democrat or Republican, we're going to say thanks and we're going to appreciate that. And I think Senator Fowler is a really good example of someone who is focused on needs in Cairo, of all places.
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Fowler.
Yes,
You've been
yes.
really doing a good job and working across the aisle. And I think that's something that earns support from folks who identify as Democrat and folks who identify as Republican.
It's very human to have divisions along class. It's very human to have divisions along geography. It happens in college towns. The problem is when that gets weaponized. And to me, again, we're a state whose economy is dependent on rural and urban areas. We're connected. When I was in the inaugural class of the Edgar Fellows, and I remember Governor Edgar took us, the entire class, to a working farm, and he pointed to all of those for those of us from Chicago and said, "Look, your markets on LaSalle Street don't exist without what happens here on the farm." And then he went and looked at some of the folks from around the state and said, and without the CTA, without large investments in the infrastructure in Chicago, there isn't a good way to get your crops onto the markets. And so please try to see yourselves as connected. What I would hope for, if we're thinking about bridging these divides, is to think about bringing investments to the entire state instead of pitting communities against one another. We're connected, and that narrative takes work. It's hard to bring people together when we've been told for 40 years that Chicago's to blame, or Southern Illinois is to blame, or we pay more than our fair share in taxes, they take, et cetera, et cetera. Bringing people together is more sustainable in the long term, but it's hard work because it requires talking to people instead of weaponizing the divisions.
For the southernmost, I believe, 19 counties, we get back $2.81 for every dollar we send to Springfield. Cook County, on the other hand, gets back 90 cents for every dollar they send to Springfield. So they're really a donor county. But this myth has persisted for years. And it's not indigenous to one party or the other. Both parties in Southern Illinois kind of play this up from time to time in blaming Chicago. It's this politics of resentment. But here's the thing. The Board of Higher Education in 2008, now that's 12 years ago, but they did a very important study which they termed something to do with the politics of wealth in Illinois. And they said there's really two Illinois. One Illinois is suburban Cook and the collar counties, which has very high prosperity, very high educational values, very high health outcomes, all of these things. The other is the inner city of Chicago and deep Southern Illinois, which is the other Illinois, which has basically lags far behind this first Illinois. And so we have this politics of resentment that has occurred over the years where our political people particularly, and Dale, thank you. I haven't heard you do this, so I want you to know I appreciate it. But how many people did I hear stand up in the Illinois State Senate and down here in rallies and so on, and just blast Chicago like we're the ones that are really supporting Chicago and paying for everything? We're not. We've got to stop that. There is some resentment in that we don't feel like people look towards Southern Illinois as worthy of the economic development dollars that should be coming here to help us. This port district in Cairo that Dale's been working on, with the governor's cooperation, okay? That's the kind of thing that we can do to bridge the gaps.
We need Chicago. If it weren't for Chicago and us as a region, and we keep going back to the port, if it hadn't have been for the pandemic that we're in right now, we would have already had this announced. It has been announced. There's $44 million in FY21 capital bill for the port, line item appropriated. We have that much in private investment that's ready to jump on board and invest in the region. I know, Maya, when you were running for governor, you actually came down to Cairo. I remember that segment, and obviously with my good friend Tyrone Coleman down there. And so you got to see it firsthand, and you got to see the opportunity that lies in Southern Illinois. And it's really created this vision, especially working with my colleagues in the Chicago area, in the suburbs, about what we have to offer down here, because we are unique, we are different, our terrain's different. When you have 80% of all inland barge traffic in the entire nation that flows by the city of Cairo, 80% that flows by the city of Cairo, and the state of Illinois has not been able to capitalize on that. So we have the support of Chicago for this initiative. You know, we have the support, which means everything in the world to me and to all of us. When I was presenting Southern Illinois to a lot of my colleagues in Chicago that were on the transition committee, you know, I said something. You know, I spend a lot of time in Chicago, especially visiting, work-related, and visiting our daughter. But I catch myself walking through the streets of Chicago and looking for unoccupied storefronts. And so I kind of opened up some eyes to some of my colleagues. I said, come down to Southern Illinois. I want you to come down. Let's tour around Southern Illinois. Let's go to some of our small communities, some of our amazing river towns that were the history that we have. And let's look for occupied storefronts. That's why I need you. I need your help. I need your help to continue to grow Southern Illinois to what it deserves to be.
Just down the road from me, half of the people, half of my neighbors, guess where they're from? Chicago. They're buying our hunting ground. They're coming here to retire. Half of them are coming here every weekend because they work in Chicago. Guess where they want to come? They want to come south to get away from the rat race. They want a little bit of serenity. They want what their southern regional brothers and sisters have. We need each other.
Former State House member Art Turner Sr. used to say, there's a lot in common between Lawndale and Carbondale. And he's absolutely right. And the people in Carbondale don't know it, and the people in Lawndale don't know it, but he's absolutely right. The best example is K through 12 public schools, where most of the funding is locally generated. And that means if you live in an impoverished area without big factories, without big shopping centers, you're funding your education on the cheap. If we had a smarter system of school funding that was more state-based, then as a state, we could set a higher minimum. We have schools in Southern Illinois that are just barely meeting the recommended minimum standard for funding. And that's because in that area, we do try to, more than some other areas, go it alone, on our own. And we haven't figured out that if we can connect up with the folks in Lawndale and say, hey, let's make a better system for all of us, then as a state, we're going to be moving forward, not just better for Southern Illinois, but better for the whole state.
A lot of the divisiveness that we see between urban and rural centers, it's a long-standing set of stories, politics, efforts to undermine either public institutions, to pit working people against one another, to make it harder to move on equitable public policy. And that is a history that we have to contend with today. We're being torn apart by really toxic narratives and inward nationalism. And the question we have leading into November and then in the next year, as we think about economic recovery around COVID, is, so what are we going to do to change the narratives? Do we trust one another? And I'm not just talking about people who are living in concentrated poverty or the working poor. I'm talking about everybody else. Up and down the spectrum is struggling. And I think that should be the primary focus, and figuring out how do we invest in one another and do it in a way that is equitable, do it in a way that brings people together.
Thanks again to all of you for a wonderful discussion. I look forward to the day, hopefully very soon, that we could actually convene together in a conference room, maybe at the Simon Institute, and have this discussion and just see how our efforts to forge one Illinois come to fruition. So with that, let me turn it to Matt.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Rhonda Belford, Dale Fowler, Amaya Pawar, Glenn Pichard, and Sheila Simon for your insights. The potential for homegrown civic and political leadership in this region abounds. Some of our future leaders are cutting their teeth on issues such as those that we're discussing this evening as participants in the award-winning Model Illinois Government team from nearby Southeastern Illinois College. Let's hear from some students and alumni and watch them debate an especially important issue involving population distribution and political power. Here's the team's faculty advisor, Matthew Lees, to get us started.
Model Illinois Government, or MIG, is a legislative simulation competition where our students get to play the roles of legislators and constitutional officers. They get to put on suits, head to the state capitol, and over 4 days, debate and compete with 250 students from 14 colleges and universities from across the state in the actual House and Senate chambers in Springfield. Since those 14 colleges and universities are located across virtually every corner of the state, all students are exposed to diverse perspectives ranging from urban regions like Chicago to downstate rural communities in central and southern Illinois. At this year's competition, this team led all small delegations in total points, leadership positions, led all schools in points per delegate, and set a new school record in major awards. It's time to jump into debate. The students are going to be arguing the merits and the lack thereof of the Electoral College. Before we get started, I want to make one point clear. Some of our participants are playing devil's advocate. They don't actually hold some of the views they'll be expressing. With that said, they'll be making the strongest arguments they can muster for their particular side. I often instruct my students, you don't fully know your own beliefs until you know and can properly articulate your opponent's position. At this time, I'm going to open the floor for opening statements. I'm going to recognize Mr. Majority for his 2-minute round. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I rise before you in strong opposition of the Electoral College. We can actually look at this now as a modern day voter suppression. As my colleagues on the right, they are going to try to tell you, but that this is a fair system that gives everybody a chance to vote. And I stand here before you today telling you that is not true. Not everybody can vote, and this is only a two-party system. But let's remember one thing. We also now have more than 2 parties in our country. This system ignores the people. They say our vote counts, but does it really? The president, whoever wants to win the presidency, they only have to go to a certain number of states and spend that time. They don't have to go everywhere because they know we can go here or we can go there and we will have those votes.
It creates a system where the president of the United States doesn't have to win a majority of the votes cast, but he has to win a majority of our nation. It allows for states like the smaller states and the rural communities that we have, just like we have here in Illinois, to be able to have a voice. It doesn't create voter suppression. Everyone's still allowed to vote. You're able to go and cast your vote in your state. And this system is the only thing that ensures a fair, balanced election and a president that will represent not just the majority of people, but the majority of our nation. And the Electoral College protects the minority, and that's what this system and our Constitution is all about.
What about the swing states? Swing states hold power over what? You want to tell me there's 20 states that can decide an election?
The founding fathers created this system in about 1776, and this is 2020, where whenever they created that system, they kept people who didn't own land, women, slaves, those who were not uneducated. This was to keep the uneducated people from voting. This is an issue for today's community too, because they're constantly trying to add new things to this Electoral College, like poll taxes. It goes into so much more than just being the Electoral College.
First things first, the Electoral College has many racist origins, as my esteemed colleague, Representative Smith, had to say. More than 2 centuries after it was designed to empower Southern white voters, the system continues to do exactly that, sir.
There's only been 5 times in history that the president won by votes from the electoral college and not by the popular vote. So clearly the system is working, because if the electoral college is as corrupt as the left is wanting to make it seem, then that number would be much, much higher. We need the electoral college because most of our country is either uninformed or extremely misinformed, and emphasis on the misinformed. My colleague to the left stated earlier that this was a system to keep people down. Well, clearly today that's not the case, because if they were kept down, then no one would be voting, and no one is discriminated against. Everyone has the right to vote. And it's unfortunate that with all of this technology that we have out there for people to get this information, they still think that good information is from Facebook or Wikipedia.
We have the internet. Most people, even in rural areas, they even have cell phones. They can look up the information that they need on their specific candidate. I also like to bring up how this form also discourages people from wanting to vote. And why is that? Because they say our vote do not count. Let's bring up Southern Illinois, for example. It's very blue, but the rest of the state is very red. What happens? People think, well, since I'm a Democrat, this is not going to work because there's more Republicans.
I would rather have states and then people within those states switch over time to decide elections than large cities that completely deny the rural communities that make up the majority of this nation. Also, what problem do my colleagues have on the left with educated voters? They have hit on that twice now. What is the problem with someone being educated before they vote? I prefer that everyone does some research before they vote, because if they did, we'd probably have a little less taxes in Illinois.
I think my colleagues on the left forget that the Electoral College was an ingenious compromise, allowing the popular election of the president, but on a state-by-state basis. Citizens vote for president with the winner in each state taking all the state's electoral votes based on the number of seats that the state has in the Senate and the House combined. In this sense, the Electoral College is no more undemocratic than the Senate or the Supreme Court. Without the Electoral College, groups such as Iowa farmers and Ohio factory workers would be ignored. In fact, I think this debate shows that my colleagues on the left only care about places like New York and California and not rural America.
Only 60% of the US population can vote, and of that 60%, only 40% of those vote. Why does only, less than half vote? The number one reason for that is because of the Electoral College. People feel as though their vote doesn't count, and that's correct.
Earlier, the majority leader talked about how Southern Illinois is blue and how the rest of the state is red. And then he goes on to say, we care about all these communities, but if he truly cared about those communities, he would know Southern Illinois has been a very red part of the state, and so has pretty much everything south of I-80 for many years now. The problem is, you can look at the Electoral College and the state of Illinois as an example. We see the city of Chicago deciding the politics of how the entire state is going to be governed. What the Electoral College does is it allows these rural communities across America to continue to have a voice and to continue to be representative. Because what we do not want is a president who focuses on cities and urban style of electorates instead of worrying about the real vote. Because if we forget about the real vote, we forget about Southern Illinois, we forget about every rural community and state across this country.
To make a point, that's what the left is all about, is letting the minority groups express their opinions. And again, if we didn't have the Electoral College, their opinions wouldn't even be heard.
The Electoral College is anti-democratic, given that 40% registered voters in the United States are registered independent, 31% are registered Democrats, 25% are registered Republicans, and 4% they're registered other. My colleagues on the right will do whatever necessary to keep the Electoral College intact with those statistics. The truth is, you have never voted for president, and if the Republicans have it their way, you never will. Only 538 people in the United States will acquire the right to vote for president this year, and guess what? None of you are one of them. It is time to move ahead with abolishing the Electoral College. This system is based on a centuries-old theory as well as a document that has been amended time and time again to correct the mistakes our founding fathers made. The founders worried that Democratic electorates tend to be ignorant and easily swayed. Perhaps this had something to do with the fact that people of color were only considered to be a fraction of a person. They were denied educations, the right to own land, and the right to vote, alongside women who were no more than a vessel for the white man's offspring. On November 6th of 2012, Donald Trump tweeted, "The Electoral College is a disaster for democracy." For once, I could say that Trump was correct, and now more than ever is the time for action to make sure that never again is the loser in an election made president of the United States.
They continue to talk about how they care about this area, but they don't. They care about the city of Chicago, they care about New York, and they care about Los Angeles. They don't care about rural America. They don't care about farmers. They don't care about the rights that have been enshrined in the Constitution of the United States to protect the minority for year in and year out.
I want to point out that to my colleagues that the founders want to balance the will of the populace against the risk of tyranny at the majority, in which the voices of the masses can drown out minority interests. Right now, to win the election, presidential candidates need electoral votes from multiple regions, and therefore they build campaign platforms with a national focus, meaning that the winner will actually be serving the needs of the entire nation.
All those in favor of abolishing the Electoral College, please indicate by stating aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay.
Nay.
Abstentions? It's been the chair that there is a tie in the chamber, 3-3. Ultimately, our audience at home gets to make the call.
Our thanks to the Model Illinois Government team from Southeastern Illinois College. Very impressive and very thought-provoking. As we come to the last segment of our show, we'll consider how some of these issues are playing out in current events that affect people's lives here in Southeastern Illinois. We're joined now by two accomplished journalists who cover this part of the state, Travis Daniel of the Harrisburg Daily Register and Molly Parker of the Southern Illinoisan.
I wrote a story a couple years ago called Forsaken Egypt, and I took a look at the counties in the lower part of the state, really sort of the lower 7 counties, plus Saline and Gallatin, those that I consider to be sort of in the Ohio River Valley region, and just wanted to look at where things stood. You know, I grew up in Johnson County in the lower 7 counties there, and poverty has always been a big part of life in that region. As anyone from here knows, a lot of families struggle to make ends meet. I was alarmed at how deep that poverty has gotten entrenched in many of our communities in just the last 2 decades or so. There's been just countless conversations about trying to climb out of that poverty for, I'm sure, generations, but unfortunately we're moving in the wrong direction. And I think in talking to a lot of people that I did along the way in many of the counties there, including in Gallatin, they expressed this feeling of disconnect from the centers of power in Springfield and in Washington. And I think a lot of that has to do with not having big numbers of people. There was a time when Southern Illinois had more political clout, and a lot of that has faded away for many complex reasons, including our population loss, but also just the way that we, were represented in the Illinois House and Senate. We used to have, 3 representatives per district. That it required more negotiation with Chicago, and a lot of things have happened to erode the political base in Southern Illinois. And that feeling of being forgotten is pretty pervasive across Gallatin County, but certainly many of the other counties in our region from the center of power.
The only thing I was going to add, there was a very astute observation about the decline of representation, and the phenomenon I've always described it as whenever there's a census and we are going to have less representation, they give us more land in our geographical district, and so fewer people overall are represented in a much larger area, and that's unfortunately the way it's been going for years now. I was going to talk a little bit about how the COVID-19 epidemic pandemic has been affecting the Southern Illinois counties, specifically Gallatin County. Gallatin is part of the Egyptian Health Department's area of service, which includes Saline and White County as well. But the problem is suddenly we've had some flashpoints. We've had high numbers. Very early July, we were in the single digits still, and we've exploded. Saline County, that was Saline County. Gallatin County had fewer than 10 as well. I think maybe 5 or 6. They've got about 45 or 50 now. Had 1 death. But the biggest issue economically, and it goes right back to population distribution in Gallatin County, a county of about 5,000 people, very rural county, things are very spread out. As this pandemic spread, it was naturally more insulated than areas where population density was higher. But now the way the state's response has evolved is possibly going to hurt it, because early on, all of Illinois was sort of shut down, including the southern counties where the pandemic had not really spread to yet. Now that the state has evolved its response, and it is a regionalized approach, which a lot of folks in this area were calling for very early on, now that it's finally made its way here and is really, showing up, and our number of cases per 100,000 is over that metric that the state is looking at. Gallatin County may very well have sole proprietorships, of which we have a lot, shut down in response. Beauticians, that sort of, maybe massage therapists, that sort of a business where it's just a one-on-one person to client business where there's, a lot of possible contact. So I'm afraid that, it's a double whammy for them. They got hit early on with the rest of the state, and now they may get hit again because of the regionalized approach. And it's kind of a shame, because if they had had a regionalized approach early on, maybe they wouldn't have been affected early on and could have kind of prepared for this more.
I would just say, I think the story I wrote about poverty and economic angst and the COVID pandemic that we're seeing playing out now in Gallatin County, these things go hand in hand in many ways. On the job front, people feeling like the governor's office isn't maybe hearing them about the regionalized approach and how critical that is. I've had people blame people in Southern Illinois, for not wearing masks, not taking this seriously. And while some of that may be true, I also think there was some fair criticism back that we weren't maybe prioritized in some of these decisions that we hadn't early on, while we were closed down, experienced in some of these really rural counties any cases of the pandemic while they're shut down. Now they may have to shut down while they're actually experiencing it. But again, like Travis said, a double whammy there. And when people say they weren't taking it seriously, I don't know that that's true overall, but I think people also know that poverty is also, it shortens your lifespan, right? People in Gallatin County and those surrounding counties have shorter lifespans than the rest of the state already. So acting like the economy and the ability to provide for your family isn't part of that conversation, I think, frustrated people, and maybe they became distrustful of the government. I think these things, again, go hand in hand. At the same time, it is alarming to see those rates growing up, because these counties that we're talking about, including Gallatin, have high rates of all the things that go along with poverty, including, poor health comorbidities, obesity, high cancer rates, all the things that make you more susceptible to COVID-19. And then, on top of that, having lower access to hospital care and healthcare and all of those things. So I think, these things and plaguing rural America are just very much maybe exposed through the COVID-19 pandemic. I would just say that for all the things we're talking about that are really challenging, that this is one of the most beautiful areas in the country. I love it here. This is my home. Gallatin County offers so much history and so much beauty in the Shawnee Forest. And I also think there's a lot of good things going on with people, pushes to try to address this issue with poverty. You've got a really, active health department working on the COVID-19 situation. And you have people just doing really creative things like the 276 Art Exchange, which is one of the coolest things in Southern Illinois, where they're displaying local artists at a gallery where you can go in and buy their artwork and have a good time next to the Red Onion. And so there's lots of good things going on there. I definitely want to stress that.
I have to agree. About 20 years ago, I worked for the Harrisburg paper at that time and covered Gallatin County. And some people already knew, got to meet a whole lot of others. And besides the history, besides the scenic beauty, just the people from Gallatin County are some of the most wonderful people I've ever met. And what's always been interesting to me is I've been to public meetings over there where you could have two people who've known each other for 20 or 30 years or longer, really get into it over an issue, but just don't see eye to eye, at least during that meeting. And then after the meeting, they're shaking hands, they're patting each other on the back, and they're very, very nice job of being able to take public service in one lens, and then personal relationships in another lens. So, like I said, the people are wonderful, and all the other things that Molly mentioned. The history is just I guess there's not a good way to put it with the history that's still there. And that's where the low population density does play into a strength. I think that with fewer people, I think it's easier to not have things knocked down to make room for new buildings and whatnot. So that's why we still have the old 5-column bank and the John Marshall Bank over there and some of the other spots.
Thank you, Molly and Travis. Your insights as journalists were really, really illuminating. And I want to thank Matt Meacham, our very own statewide engagement manager for Illinois Humanities. Matt, you did an incredible job putting this program together and serving as our host for tonight. And thank you to everyone who joined us for People, Places, and Power, Gallatin County edition. We loved being able to hear your thoughts and try to respond to some of your questions in the chat. Now, tonight's program simply would not have been possible without the brilliance and generosity of our partners, the Gallatin County Historical Society, the Ohio River Scenic Byway Visitors Center in Equality, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, Baldwin Media Development of El Dorado produced and edited the video, and I think they did a great job. Funding for tonight's program was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and the Mellon Foundation. But to our supporters around the state tuning in tonight, thank you. It's because of you, all of our programs are free. And because of you, we're able to ensure that individuals from communities of color and indigenous communities, the people living on low income, the counties and towns and rural areas, that all of our small arts and cultural organizations around the state, and communities highly impacted by mass incarceration. It's because of you that all of these people and places have access to the power of the humanities. We're going to conclude tonight's program with beautiful photographs of Gallatin County by Christy Short and Gary Daniil. And these images are going to be accompanied by a rendition of Shawneetown from our distinguished Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholar, Chris Villillo. This is a special song that combines material drawn from folk tradition and 19th century documents with content by songwriter Dylan Buston. I hope you'll join us again in October for another installment of The Country and the City, Common Ground in the Prairie State. To learn more about Illinois Humanities, to ask us questions about this program, to join our social media community, reach us online at www.illinoishumanities.org. Have a great evening and stay well. Thanks.
Well, sun pulls up, but we float down, way down the Ohio to Shawneetown. And it's hard on the beach shore, she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Well, it's hot in the summer, boys, the air is thick and dank, that darn old fog so heavy that I cannot see the bank. And it's hard on the beach shore, she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Now the current's got her, boys, we'll take up some slack, we'll float her down to Shawneetown, then we'll bushwhack her back. And it's hard on the beach shore, she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Now I got a wife in Louisville and one in New Orleans, and when I get to Shawneetown I'm gonna see my Indian queen. And it's hard on the beach shore, she moves too slow, way down to Shawneetown on the Ohio. Yes, it's hard on the beach shore, she moves too slow, way down to Shawnee Town on the Ohio.